Welcome, everybody, to Mentor Time. Today's Mentor Time is a topic I get asked about a lot, and sometimes I remark on it when I'm working with people on step 2 in the course on your long CV, and that is how and if at all do I describe what I've done in university, graduate school, undergraduate. So I'm tackling this today, and many of you will hear things. That's still the same advice for just updating our jobs and things. It's true. But I'm going to give you a framework so you can grasp what does it mean to take credit for certain things in university. Takeaway, you can take credit for university learning as experience. I'm curious, I set up a Slido poll. We're not a big number today, but I'm wondering, how did you include student work on your resume? I didn't have anything to put there. I added it under experience, or I didn't know what schoolwork would count. One person said, I didn't know what schoolwork would count. And that's what I hear over and over again. Here's what we're going to talk about today. We'll start with, I worked hard in university. Is it just learning? How do I really show my school experience? And then, as always, we end with, what should you do? So let's start in, is it just learning? I'm going to show you a framework for what I think counts as experience. And I'm going to ask us again, either on Slido or in the chat, give me an example of what you think would count as experience during your university, undergraduate, graduate, whatever works for you. A thesis? Good. Doing data analysis, policy briefs? Yeah. Yes, and it depends. You'll see from the framework. In fact, here's the things that I see in writing or that people tell me. I wrote my thesis on, I collated interview responses. I was elected to represent students in, now, all of those may be experience, but the way they're stated, they're not stated as experience that you can necessarily count. So let's go through this framework to identify learning as experience. There are 4 different categories: how the learning was done, what role you had, what you actually did, and what the audience for it is. So I'm going to take each one. I'm building the framework, and then after each section, I'm going to show you what I think that it involves. Learning usually occurs either individually or in a group. You could call it a pair, but anything more than one. And that is either you work independently towards an outcome, or you work as a group with a shared vision and shared outcome. That may be learning experience, or it may be just a group project. I don't mean to sound like group projects don't have their value, but in terms of actual experience, we'll go through it when we get to audience. All right, so we're back to the framework. Your role is often going to be teaching, research, admin. There are other things, but these are the big categories that most students mostly have: teaching assistant, research assistant, admin assistant. And this is where you describe the focus of your work, because you can actually do administrative work in teaching and research in assistantships, for example, of course, in administrative work. When we get to what it is, these are the specifics of the work being done. And all of these verbs here are things you know that we use. They're strong verbs that lead you towards results, towards evidence-based results and outcomes. Here's where we begin to get down to, is it really experience or is it just learning? And learning has its place. We all have to learn, but it may not be experience. Usually, it's one of these 3 things. A professor or a teaching assistant grades your work. Professor or staff might use the results in a project, in a research study, in something else that you've been working with him or her on. And the results finally might be shared with an external audience. Now, the first one doesn't count as experience because if you're doing work just for a professor to get a grade, there is no vetting of your work beyond what the professor thinks. When you write a paper on a specific subject, you write a 5-page paper for the professor, he's looking for you to demonstrate that you've gained information about and maybe even mastery of key concepts, of solving problems, of being able to state the issues and then potential solutions. But that doesn't go any farther than filling the need for a product to be able to give you a grade on. On the other hand, when a professor has you help him or her as a research assistant, you may be doing a variety of things. Most of the time, research assistants are working on research that's funded to the professor or to staff. There may be staff work, such as administrative work for staff, HR, or tracking student attendance over time, where you are doing real work that someone needs to make their work go forward. And finally, sometimes you actually work on things where your work and the results will go on to a wider audience. For example, if you did data analysis work and did some briefing PowerPoint slides of that data in different graphics for a professor who's going to present it to a Ministry of Health briefing panel, that is something that we know has to be more than what you submit for a grade. That has to be valid work experience. You're showing your number one would be working with real data, and number two, you'd be giving the results in a way that others can use them. So as we take this forward, I just put this up here to remind us. Now that you know that, name one thing you think you could count as, I wrote grad school here, I forgot to change it, but some university, undergraduate, graduate, what would be something you could count as grad school experience you hadn't counted yet? We've got writing a literature review. Yes, if the professor is going to be using it, for example, in his research report for whatever study is being conducted. Let's go on to how do you show this? I decided to do a mini agenda for this section, so you know what I'm going to try to cover quickly because I don't want to get bogged down in details, although I do give you sample ways to write it. We'll start with research. I wrote a thesis. We'll then go on to civic engagement and leadership. Maybe you were elected position, appointed, volunteered. Teaching assistant. And then we'll also cover internship or field experience and courses, long and short, because I often get a question about why I don't want you to feel you can emphasize all the courses you've taken either in school or alongside schoolwork. And we'll talk about that. So thinking back, how well do you feel you've shown your university experience on your CV? Not at all the way up to very well. Okay, so adequately. And we probably, if we weren't already more than 5 years out of school, would want to go back, and you'll hear more about that later. Let's go on to, I wrote a thesis. Since we have so few people, I don't know if someone wants to unmute and tell me your thoughts. What does a thesis represent?
It represents having done research.
You get pom-poms. That's exactly, thank you, Peter, for volunteering. That's exactly it. It is not the thesis. Yes, that's important. It's the product. But you actually conducted a research study. And when you're in school, when you're in university, you have to make sure that you graduate all of these skills. This is just a list of everything I could think of that was at the high level of the things, from planning getting IRB clearance, implementing the intervention if it's primary data collection, training people to collect data, clean it, analyze it, synthesize, disseminate it, write things. But guess what? This research also gives you additional skills. Obviously, the first one is all the research methods, quant and qual research, analytical, data viz. But planning and strategy. Many people I worked with many years ago didn't know that conducting a research study also meant you had to figure out logistics and administration, like how were you going to travel across Kenya? How many days did you need between arranging observation days? Those are administrative skills. Interpersonal skills. You've got to be able to communicate with different groups that you're working with. Negotiations, if you have a larger team and you're talking about who does what kinds of things. Teamwork skills, speaking, writing skills, and a big one that people forget about. Obtaining IRB clearance is very similar to the kind of clearance you're going to need from government agencies, whether you're a government employee or you're receiving funding from the government for certain kinds of research. Here's how I have seen it put on many CVs. This is a before example. Someone puts it under their actual degree in the education section, and they tell me thesis looked at.
Two.
Here's how I usually have seen it come through on CVs. It's put under the education section where the person lists the degree, the university, the year, and then it gives a brief description of the thesis. And in here, we see a method for this and looking at variables. We don't know overall even what the study's on. So this isn't where you want to put it. You want to put it under experience. This isn't just I got it at the end of the time before I graduated. It took me 2 years to do this. You can see 2019 to 2021. This will be written, and I tried to pick out the high level things that this person who did it beginning to end and described initially conducting this kind of study and what the question was, and then the high level pieces that you did. Now, in some cases, people use secondary data, but in that similar vein, if you're not doing primary data collection, you still have to get approval. You have to go through the data set and find what you need. There may be people who don't have to do certain parts of a thesis. I know in some universities, you may write a couple papers, a methods paper, and then you may write a results discussion paper, but not all the in between. But as you can see at the bottom, then we talk about what you did to disseminate the work, because research by itself isn't helpful to anybody. That's just a set of results until you disseminate it in a way that different audiences can use it. Let's turn now to elected to serve. This is what I call civic engagement or leadership. I'm using the example of elected to represent students. So this was on someone who took the course, his recent work in his CV. Useful, we know that he's representing students on a committee, council, but then we know he was elected competitively. That's great. And I don't know what identified issues around resilience means. So we're not going to do that. We're going to put it as experience. Again, he's got a 2-year period for his term of office. And we see that he represented these students in a 2-year term as the sole student representative in a competitive election. So you can say that this was a big selection deal without saying it separately. And what you'll see that I've written here is identifying issues, bringing them to the council. That's what your job is as the representative. And then defining solutions. So if I looked at this, the first two are results, evidence-based results. And the third one is actually an achievement. It's evidence of impact. Splitting hairs between results and achievements, but it's a big deal if you can say they initiated a program you developed, which they did. And in terms of leadership, I often hear people are appointed ambassadors as they're in undergraduate or graduate school. So the youth ambassador at the Peace Institute had work that they were able to do to help the Peace Institute put together their work stream successes and put information out. But they also raised awareness of the Peace Institute's successes. And defined in there in the little brackets are, here are the metrics that we measured. So we know that there's some achievement there, that we're seeing some impact. On to teaching. I didn't write what most people usually end up writing: assisting the professor to monitor classes, grading papers. I wrote you the things that I think you should think about if you are a teaching assistant. So the grading of papers is down at the bottom, but it focuses on acquisition of concepts, being able to prove your mastery of it. The top is on instructional methods, and then using office hours and peer pairing in this case. There's a lot that would be relevant to any of you who are teaching assistants. Back to Slido. Just a word or two, or in the chat box, what surprised you so far? Anything? It's okay to say nothing. Use student representative position. Thank you. That's really helpful. All right, on to internships and field experience. You're getting the message, and many of you have worked with Ron and me for quite a while, so you know it's all about framing the work that you've done that other people can understand how you help solve problems. Here's someone who said that they were a communications intern and they called it their field work of enhancing health education skills. They did this for over 3 months. That is an adequate amount of time to enhance your health education skills. But what people want to know is not what you get out of it, but what they get out of it. For example, this communications intern was hired to lead the updating of their health ed initiatives for 3 of the boroughs. So you'll notice in each of the areas, the person said, I did this in less than 3 weeks. By the 4th week, everybody was using the new materials. And then I worked and traveled to each borough to make sure the events were supported. So you can see there the results and achievement. Let's turn to courses long and short. They can be as short as online courses of an hour to going to a 6-month weekly course or a certificate that's a year or 2. But generally, in school or soon after school, I'm finding people are taking these courses. Data analytics now, big deal. People have been coding spreading wider and wider. Data viz and graphics development, we're all looking at doing more visually. Learning how to do project implementation plans, scale-up plans, evaluation plans. Technical area updates, this would be for some people in IT, more certificates on different coding languages, or even frameworks for the operating systems. And finally, languages is part of that. So this mini takeaway stop is to say, it's not the learning, it's how you used it. So let's go back to our framework and look again in the audience. The professor or the staff uses the results in a project or study or has some use for the work that you're doing. Or the results are shared with an audience that's external, whether it's by the professor directly. In one case, I know a group of students had a group project where they were designing an evaluation for a local NGO. So you're going to describe the products from the learning. And when this person told me that he took an intensive certificate in French, yay, I'm all about it. But it's all about him. I developed skills in this. I learned about this. I developed more skills in this. We're not going to do that. We're going to write this as experience. You're going to talk about how quickly you achieved the level. The course was for an A2 level diploma. You achieved the A2 level diploma overall in 2 months. But by week 2, and here you're giving examples, went to the market, talked to vendors, could understand museum docents. These show that you've learned and you're applying it. And then after a month, conversational, held course practice sessions, things like that. These are ways that you can show the learning in what you've done. I'm going to give you, I hope, a pretty easy one. Describe in the chat box, how would you show what your experience was after you did the course, the learning? And I'll go ahead and add mine here. We have one that said, created a map showing the impacts of flooding on displaced persons camps in a certain country, like a GIS course that this person did. Exactly. This is exactly it. Here's what I want you to tell me. What did you do with that map? So let me describe something that was just before that. Someone else put in, I volunteered to make graphs and charts for my neighbor who's a lawyer and his law practice needed a presentation. So you've got a way to say they needed something that was going to be something that they were going to use for their business. You don't have to say, I did it for my neighbor. You say, I did it a law practice that I knew about. The creating a map may be that you were able to show it to the people that were affected by it, or maybe you worked in a situation where you knew emergency personnel, like the hurricane we just had down in North Carolina and Florida. And they may have been very appreciative of having that map of where the flooding was and where displaced persons were. You can create your own situations to apply your learning to a real world situation. When people on LinkedIn tell me, and this is a prelude to going on to what should you do, tell me they use the template from LinkedIn. I just finished this data course and got certified in whatever data stuff they're doing, coding. I always write to them individually and say, how are you using it? What are you doing with it to keep your skills up to date and to get more practice? Similar to when I say to you, a skill is not experience, a skill is evidence of learning. When you show where you've put it into experience, you're that much farther ahead. The framework's going to be there behind the things we're discussing. There aren't a whole lot of new things for you. But if you're in university now or have recently graduated, you're going to inventory your experience. You're going to review your whole experience in school, in university, to identify it. And I suggest starting with the products because those seem to be easier. I made a briefing memo. I wrote my thesis, and then apply the framework to help you describe, oh, what did I actually do? So we took apart Thesis. That's a very dramatic example. Thank you, Peter, for outlining that was a demonstration of research. And research is a very extensive process, and it also, like most project management, has sequential steps in it. After you've identified your experience, you're going to revise your CV to include that information in experience, and also then put your products in your intellectual property section, reports and the likewise. If it's been more than 5 years since you graduated, the question I ask you to think about is, do you need your university experience there? You may not. But if you do, revise your CV to include relevant experiences. I think someone said that they would have put a leadership position in there. Also, whether you need to update your CV for older history or not, this now gives you a better way to help other professionals who are starting out better represent what they actually came with and that they aren't necessarily taking credit for. I'm going to emphasize the takeaway again. You can take credit for your university learning as experience. And the corollary of that is, I'd suggest that you apply the framework I developed for you to categorize what actually counts as experience. I'm going to see if anybody in the audience would like to make any remarks or comments.
I was wondering, Sue, do you suggest or what do you think about using papers that you wrote in university as a writing sample for when you're going through an interview process?
Are you talking about someone who's experienced in his career like you and me, or are you talking about people closer to graduating or having just graduated?
A person closer to graduating or having just graduated.
Thanks for that question. Yes, the writing samples can be things that you wrote in graduate school, but it has to be thought out. What's the relationship of what I'm being interviewed for to the work I've done? I still remember a graduate school paper I had to write on health systems in the US. It's one of the few things I had when someone was trying to hire me. And I didn't have a referee journal article. So I said to them, this is the only thing I've written. And they said, in a way, don't bother sending it. The title is not of interest to us. So think about what it is you're trying to show. For example, Peter, do you have any titles of papers you can think of?
Not offhand, but I'm thinking particularly when for my program, I wrote a lot of policy brief, policy memo type things. One was a made up policy memo that I wrote on something about water quality in the Gambia where I had done Peace Corps. So I just made it up from my time there.
But you used real data and a real country.
Yeah, I had included some things like that in that. Yeah.
So I think that's very appropriate. If you're in school and you want to show that you wrote a policy brief, you don't have to say to them it never went to the Gambian government or whatever. You can just say this represented the water quality situation 2 years ago in Gambia or with whatever most recent data there is. I use these kinds of methods nowadays. What they want to know is that you can write succinctly, write in a way that makes reading easy for the reader to absorb the information. And there's a proliferation of more and more one pagers, two pagers, things like that. So I think that's a great example and a great question. Thank you.
I have another question that it relates to LinkedIn. What do you think about on LinkedIn you can list your courses that you did. Do you think that's worth doing or does it not really matter?
I think it depends on the field you're in. If
Okay.
you are in data heavy stuff and you want to show biostats, epi, you can show your courses. The beauty of LinkedIn is the farther down you go, the more people understand it's supplementary information. Most people aren't going to look at it. Would it show up in a search if someone used LinkedIn Recruiter to get a fancy search with all those terms in it? Yes, and actually it shows up even in a Boolean search that you can do yourself. So I don't think it's harmful, but I don't want people to start going and putting in every single course they took because that's going to take time away from you thinking, what am I really wanting to use this platform for? I really go back to this idea of what in the university learning is experience. So even though people graduated with MPHs and majored in EPI, if they don't have experience already by the time they graduate, at least from their capstone or internship, then I'm asking myself, what have they learned other than sitting in epidemiology classes? Those are hard, but doing advanced epi problems doesn't show that you know how to go out and design and implement an epidemiological study. So I think we have to ask ourselves what the value of it is. For younger professionals, I would envision that you should put in your important courses. But I know from the people that work with me and Ron through the professional presence course, if we can just get you to put your focus on your first box and put your about and then do a couple comments a week, that's about all most people can handle. For those who are building a totally new profile, have at it if you want to list your courses. I'd rather you spend time describing the way you've used that research, because most schools nowadays, in your internship and your capstone, expect practical relationship between what you learned in sitting in classes and doing your assignments, how you've applied it to a real world practical situation, which is great that they now have that expectation. Does that answer your question, Peter?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Thanks, Peter.